Welcome back, and I want to do a brief video on some core theology within the book of Exodus. This is introductory. I invite you to jump into my Exodus playlist for additional deeper dives, but for now, I want to frame out Exodus in terms of freedom. A lot of times we think of the book of Exodus as a book about liberation, which it is. But sometimes we miss the weight of the biblical argument about what liberation actually is. Because often when we think about liberation, we think about freedom from something, right? And so when we think about the book of Exodus, it's clear that God delivers God's people out of bondage to Egypt. So that Exodus is a book about freedom from Egyptian bondage. And if you've watched any of the movies, the Ten Commandments, the Prince of Egypt, if you just think of the popular imagination, what the book of Exodus is about, we usually, and even the word itself, the book of Exodus is from the Greek word exodos, which means the way out. We think of freedom from. But I want to suggest to you that the critical piece for reading Exodus for the church is to get the other side of a liberation. It's freedom for. And I believe if you even witness history, it's often easier to get someone out of a jam than to create some beautiful world on the other side of liberation. We've seen that over and over again in different revolutionary movements. And so in the book of Exodus, and you can even see this the way the book is made up. If you just open up and flip through the book of Exodus, the actual Exodus that leads them out of Egypt is really just 1:1 to 15:21. By the time you're at 15:22, you're in the wilderness and Israel is just moving to Sinai, right? And so if you think of it that way, from 15:22 all the way to the end of the book of Exodus, which is chapter 40, verse 38, they're not in Egypt anymore. So the bulk of the book of Exodus, and this is something that's critical if we're going to read it correctly, isn't about getting Israel out of Egypt. The bulk of the book of Exodus is getting Egypt out of Israel. And the latter is a lot more difficult. So it's not just a freedom from, it's a freedom for. It's a freedom from bondage to Pharaoh, who was an unjust ruler, but it's a freedom for service to God. You know, at the beginning of the book, Israel was building cities, Ramses and Pithom for the Pharaoh. By the end of the book, in the biggest chunk of the book actually, from Exodus 25 all the way to 40, they're building the tabernacle of the Lord. And so it's a freedom from to a freedom for. The New Testament plays along with this theme as well. Paul in Romans 6, for example, talks about moving from being slaves of sin to being slaves of righteousness. So it's not just about freedom. That's a critical piece. When we think about a liberating theology, it's not just enough to get freed from the devil, unless we also get freed fully for becoming the people that God created us to be. And so in the book of Exodus, there's this incredible language. You can see this especially in Exodus 19, 3-6, which is kind of a pivotal passage that you can look at the whole book. It talks about being released from Egypt in order to be in relationship with God, to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And so it's freedom from and freedom for. And we want to note that the book of Exodus itself basically moves Israel from Egypt to Sinai, but they're on the way to the promised land, the land that God swore to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. So Exodus invites us to go back and look at the promises that God had made to Israel's ancestors back in Genesis 12 to 50, and how this God is now faithful and God is leading them into the land. And out of that land, they're going to function as that priestly kingdom and a holy nation. That's going to be a community with an ethos of mission, of community, and of holiness. So how does that come together? And again, this is just a short introduction, and I've just given a brief overview to get you excited about the book. Well, the greatest threat to Israel's moving from freedom from to freedom for shows up in the golden calf narrative. And what does the golden calf represent? It represents idolatry. And that's what we have to remember. The greatest threat to the love for God isn't suddenly hating God. It's actually mixing the worship of the true God with the worship of other things. You know, what happened to God's people in the desert? They were worried about Moses, so they erect a golden calf. Aaron even calls it a festival to the Lord, but God was upset about it, and Moses was upset about it. Why? Because it had brought God and made God something other than who God really was. God was the God who delivered them out of Egypt, the transcendent God that had come into the world and called God's people to be part of that, and called God's people not to be like all the other religions around them, but to be wholeheartedly for God, which at its core meant not making God simply something that you could portray with a golden calf idol. So idolatry is always going to be the threat. And so as we think about what does freedom from look like today, the danger is when we're going freedom for, it's not replacing commitment to the gospel and to Jesus Christ with some other God, which most likely in our day is going to be some ideology that co-opts our commitment to Jesus. And that can be an ideology, a political ideology from the right or from the left, right? That's always the danger. But instead, we allow the gospel to be Lord over all things. And that's what we have. When we think about Sinai, sometimes we skip over this, but the Sinai, and we look at the Pentateuch as a whole, Israel gets to Sinai at Exodus 19. Israel doesn't leave Sinai until Numbers 10:10. So think about that. Over half the book of Exodus is at Sinai. The entire book of Leviticus and about the first third of Numbers is all at Sinai. And then Deuteronomy is a recapitulation of Sinai. And you get a law code in Deuteronomy from chapter 5, verse 1, all the way through chapter 26. So the bulk of the Pentateuch is about Sinai and its ethic of love God, love neighbor. And so how do we stay from being co-opted and making golden calves in our day? It's by looking to the ethic that God taught Israel in the law. And by the way, we see this in the New Testament as well, because Jesus doesn't do away with this dual commandment. That has to be recontextualized, rethought out, and reinvigorated. And it's always going to be a critique of ideology apart from what it means to love our neighbor. So we want to be super careful with that and hear that. And then the climax of Exodus, again, the climax isn't getting Israel out of Egypt. The climax is the last paragraph of Exodus where God's indwelling glory, the transcendent God, descends and becomes eminently present with Israel in the tabernacle. And then the tabernacle, when God's glory comes up in the cloud, God guides Israel to the land, right? And so what that looks like and what the witness is we have the tabernacle, which is where Yahweh was, Yahweh's presence. That's the center of God's people's lives, right? Israel was camped around it. You know, how does a holy God live in the midst of a people? Via the tabernacle, right? And then Israel, if you want to think of it this way, Israel knows God through the priestly system that gets set up. We have knowledge of who the true God is, and then the nations. And so it's critical that we get this right, that we allow to experience the freedom that God gives to us in the gospel from all the things that bind us, all the things that keep us from knowing God, all the things that keep us from loving God and loving neighbor, and be freed for that vision, which is what? It's a sanctification. So Exodus isn't so much about liberation as it is about sanctification, just to circle all the way back. Because when we're talking about a freedom for, what is the freedom for? It's the freedom to function as God's holy people for the sake of the world. If we capture that, we can get a dynamic vision for what it might look like for us today as followers of Jesus, to live in the world but not be of it, to be a force for good, to not be co-opted by human ideologies today, and instead live holy lives that point to God by the way that we love those persons around us as God's holy, sanctified people. So the next time you think about Exodus, when you read through it, ask yourself, is this book of freedom from, or is it about freedom for? It's both, and we have to hold those things together in a dynamic, truly liberating gospel that creates not just makes the world a little better, but helps us to co-work with Jesus to literally make a different world as we begin to manifest the kingdom of God in our lives, in our churches, and send out the church in the world to manifest that in workplaces and schools. There's no law against things like love and hope and faith. And the book of Exodus shows the way by showing us the way out in a dynamic way of life that allows us to be God's ambassadors of abundance as we follow. We don't have to follow the tabernacle anymore. We're following Jesus into the world on mission. And friends, I hope you'll join me in that. If you have any questions, I'd love to receive those in the comments. If you're in my class, shoot me an email. But it's an absolute privilege to serve you in this way.